On the night of August 17, 1856, at Magnolia Grove Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi, a 38-year-old enslaved woman named Patience carried out one of the strangest and most shocking acts of revenge in the history of American slavery. 8 people died in terrible pain, including the plantation owner, his wife, the cruel overseer, 2 drivers, and 3 visiting guests who had come for a celebration dinner. What was supposed to be a joyful evening to mark the purchase of 20 additional enslaved people turned into a scene of terror filled with stings, screams, and death. This unforgettable act of revenge did not begin with bees. It began 6 months earlier, when Patience was forced to watch her 12-year-old son be sold to a Louisiana slave trader right in front of her. His crime was accidental. He had broken a Chinese porcelain vase. The Mississippi Delta in 1856 was the center of the cotton economy. Wilkinson County, located along the Mississippi River between Natchez and Woodville, was home to some of the richest and most ruthless plantation owners in the South. Magnolia Grove Plantation covered 300 acres of fertile cotton land and was worked by 147 enslaved people. Cornelius Whitfield inherited the plantation from his father in 1842 and spent 14 years turning it into one of the most profitable operations in the area. Cotton prices were at a historic high, reaching 17 cents per pound in New Orleans, and Whitfield's ambitions had no limits. Life on the plantation followed a strict and unforgiving order. At the very top was Cornelius Whitfield, 52 years old, with pale blue eyes, a graying beard, and a permanent scowl that showed his belief that the world owed him everything. He had studied at the College of William and Mary in Virginia, traveled to England twice, and thought of himself as a refined planter and educated thinker. He owned a personal library of 300 books, subscribed to farming journals, and often wrote letters to other plantation owners about scientific methods of agriculture. Beneath this polished surface was a deeply cruel man who saw enslaved people as nothing more than property to be managed, bred, and discarded based on profit. His wife, Constance Whitfield, was 44 years old and came from a wealthy merchant family in Charleston. She was thin and stern, with dark hair pulled back so tightly it gave her face a constant look of anger. She controlled the household with harsh discipline, overseeing every detail herself and taking special satisfaction in punishing house slaves for even the smallest mistakes. She had never been able to have children, a source of deep shame that she turned into bitterness toward enslaved mothers and their children. The overseer, Marcus Sutton, was a 39-year-old hired man from Georgia. His face was scarred from smallpox, and his hands were rarely far from the whip hanging at his belt. Before coming to Magnolia Grove, he had worked on 5 plantations and had been dismissed from 2 for being excessively violent, even by the standards of the time. Whitfield hired him for that very reason. Sutton carried a whip with 9 leather strands, each fitted with small metal barbs that tore into flesh with every strike. He took pride in his cruelty. Below Sutton were 2 drivers, enslaved men placed in authority over other enslaved workers. Their names were Jupiter and Caesar, both in their 40s. They were hated by the field hands for their willingness to punish their own people in exchange for slightly better treatment. Jupiter was especially despised because he once beat his own brother nearly to death for stealing a small amount of cornmeal. This was the world Patience lived in. What Master Whitfield did not know was that she was far from ordinary. She had been born in 1818 in what is now Nigeria, the daughter of a minor Yoruba queen. When she was 7 years old, British slave raiders attacked her village, killing her father and capturing her and her mother. They were separated at the coastal barracks. Patience was sold to an American trader and survived the Middle Passage aboard a ship called the Prosperity. For 6 weeks she was packed so tightly in the ship's hold that she could barely move, breathing air thick with sickness and death. She arrived in New Orleans in 1825, small, frightened, and completely alone. A Mississippi cotton planter named Richard Penton bought her at auction for $230. She worked on his plantation for 8 years and was repeatedly assaulted by Penton's son, giving birth to 2 children, both of whom were sold away before they could even walk. When Penton died in 1833, his estate was sold to cover his debts. By then, she was known as Patience, a name given by a previous mistress who thought it amusing. At the age of 15, she was purchased by Cornelius Whitfield for $450. Over the next 23 years, Patience had 3 more children. 2 died as infants from illnesses that white doctors refused to treat. The third was a son she secretly named Samuel, though Master Whitfield insisted on calling him Sam. Samuel became the center of her life, a bright and gentle boy with his mother's sharp eyes and a smile that brought light into their harsh world. From the beginning, Patience was assigned to work in the plantation's gardens and orchards. She showed a natural talent with plants, and when Whitfield decided to keep beehives for honey and beeswax, she volunteered to care for them. Whitfield agreed, seeing it as a cheap way to earn extra profit. What he did not know was that Patience's mother had once been the sacred keeper of bees in their village, a role of deep spiritual importance. From the age of 4 until her capture, Patience had been taught ancient beekeeping knowledge passed down through generations of women. This knowledge went beyond simple farming skills. It included songs used to calm bees, movements used to guide a swarm, and a deep understanding of bee behavior and social order. Most important of all, she knew how bees had been used in warfare to defend villages from attackers. Patience kept this knowledge hidden for 31 years, using it only to produce fine honey that earned praise from Master Whitfield. By 1856, she managed 5 hives, each holding between 40,000 and 60,000 African honeybees, a more aggressive type known for defending their colonies with fierce intensity. Life at Magnolia Grove was filled with endless work and forced invisibility. Patience woke every morning at 40:30 when the plantation bell rang across the quarters. She lived in cabin number 17, a small 12 by 12 structure shared with Samuel and 2 other enslaved women, Rose and Dina. The cabin had a dirt floor, 1 window without glass and wide gaps in the walls. In winter, cold wind cut through the space. In summer, the heat was unbearable. After the morning bell, she had 15 minutes to eat cornmeal mush and gather her tools before going to the gardens. She worked until noon, caring for vegetables, herbs, and fruit trees. Then she had 30 minutes for lunch, usually more cornmeal and, if she was lucky, a small piece of salt pork. Her afternoons were spent in the orchards or tending the beehives, collecting honey, repairing hives, and making sure the queens and colonies remained strong. At 7 in the evening, the bell rang again to end fieldwork, though Patience's duties often lasted longer, especially during harvest time. Even in this harsh life, Patience found brief moments of peace. On Sunday afternoons, enslaved people were allowed 4 hours of limited freedom. They gathered in the quarters while an elderly man named Moses, enslaved for 63 years, led them in prayers and spiritual songs beneath a brush arbor hidden in the woods. These songs carried secret meanings. Wade in the water gave instructions for escaping through rivers to confuse tracking dogs. Follow the drinking gourd, pointed toward the North Star. Swing low, sweet chariot spoke of the promise of freedom. Patience had a deep, powerful voice. When she sang, "Didn't my Lord deliver Daniel?" the entire group felt its strength. Samuel sat beside her, learning the songs and their hidden meanings, growing into a thoughtful young boy despite the chains around him. At night, she whispered stories to him about their homeland, his grandmother the Queen, and a time when their people lived free. She taught him the few Yoruba words she still remembered and told him that no matter what the white master claimed, he came from royalty and that truth could never be taken from him. Samuel was both quick-minded and cautious, a rare combination. He worked as a house servant, polishing silver, serving meals, and standing quietly while white people spoke as if enslaved people could not hear or understand. Master Whitfield sometimes remarked that Sam was unusually intelligent, a comment that made Patience proud but deeply afraid, knowing that intelligence in an enslaved person often led to danger. Patience carried another secret, one even more closely guarded than her royal past. The older women in the quarters knew it and spoke of it in hushed voices with both respect and fear. Patience was a conjure woman. She practiced African spiritual traditions that had survived the Middle Passage, changed over time but still powerful. She knew which roots could heal and which could kill. She knew how to make protective mojo bags and charms for luck. She understood the use of graveyard dirt, crossroads dust, and red brick powder. The elderly woman named Aunt Chloe, who had been born in Africa and had lived in bondage for 70 years, had noticed Patience's gift the moment she arrived. Quietly, in hushed voices and late at night, Aunt Chloe taught Patience everything she knew, adding it to the wisdom Patience already carried from her own mother. When Aunt Chloe died in 1851, she whispered with her final breath, "The spirits chose you, child. When the time comes, you will know what to do." Patience carried those words with her every single day. She wore a small red flannel pouch around her neck, hidden under her dress, filled with roots and herbs meant for protection. She was always careful that white people never saw it, knowing they would call it dangerous superstition and punish her for it. Master Whitfield thought of himself as a fair-minded slave owner. He gave better food than many planters, a pound of salt pork and a peck of cornmeal each week to every grown slave, along with small garden plots. He allowed Sunday afternoons off from work. He did not allow enslaved people to be beaten to death, not out of kindness, but because he believed it was bad business to destroy valuable property. Still, his rules could not be questioned, and breaking them brought fast and brutal punishment. The list of offenses that earned a whipping was long: being late, working too slowly, breaking tools, speaking back, learning to read, trying to run away, stealing food even when starving, and many other acts seen as disobedience. Whippings happened at the post in the middle of the workyard, where everyone was forced to watch. The punished person was stripped to the waist, hands tied above their head to an iron ring, while the overseer delivered the ordered number of lashes, sometimes 25, sometimes 50, sometimes 100. Patience had seen dozens of these punishments over 23 years. She saw Moses receive 75 lashes for praying too loudly. She watched a young woman named Lily whipped 50 times for burning biscuits. She saw a man named Abraham given 100 lashes with salt rubbed into his wounds for trying to escape. She learned to keep her face blank and empty, because any sign of feeling could be taken as defiance and lead to punishment for her as well. Mistress Constance had her own kind of cruelty, quieter but often more damaging to the mind. She took pleasure in separating mothers from their children, often giving enslaved children away to visiting relatives as presents. She burned house slaves with hot irons for small mistakes: a wrinkled cloth, a dirty glass, a meal served a minute late. Once she forced a woman named Betsy to eat a full bowl of hot peppers because the soup lacked flavor, then refused her water for 2 days. When Betsy's throat swelled and she nearly died, Constance complained only about the trouble of training a new cook. Both Cornelius and Constance showed their greatest hatred toward what they called uppity behavior. Any sign that an enslaved person saw themselves as human instead of property. Cornelius flew into rage if slaves looked him in the eye, taking it as disrespect. Constance became especially cruel to enslaved women she thought were too pretty or too proud, finding reasons to shave their hair or mark their faces. Patience survived in this world by mixing skill with silence and careful obedience. She kept her eyes lowered. She spoke softly in the respectful way white people expected. She was always on time, always useful, always agreeable. She endured because she had Samuel, and because she believed that one day, somehow, they might reach freedom. She had heard quiet talk of the Underground Railroad, secret messages shared between plantations by traveling slaves and kind, free black people. She knew some had reached the North, though the journey was dangerous, and the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 meant even free land was not always safe. She dreamed of running away with Samuel, but she knew the dangers: bloodhounds trained to follow human scent, slave catchers who earned money for every runaway they returned, armed patrols riding the roads at night, terrible punishments waiting for those who were caught. So she waited, worked, taught her son how to survive, cared for her bees, and kept her knowledge hidden. She endured 31 years of slavery, holding on to small joys: Samuel's laughter, the taste of honey from her hives, the spiritual songs on Sunday afternoons, stories of her mother and her homeland whispered after dark. On the morning of February 14, 1856, everything changed. The day started like any other. Patience woke at 4:30, ate her cornmeal, gathered her tools, and went to the gardens. Samuel had already gone to the big house, where his work began earlier. The February air was cold, frost covering the ground, their breath showing white in the air. Mississippi winters were short but harsh. At 9 that morning, Patience heard shouting from the direction of the big house. This was common. Master Whitfield often yelled, and Mistress Constance's sharp voice carried far. But this time the sound was different, filled with a hard anger that made Patience's stomach twist with fear. She kept working, knowing stopping would draw notice, but she listened closely. Soon she heard the bell ringing fast, calling all slaves to gather in the yard at once. This was rare, usually for new rules or public punishment. Patience set down her tools and walked with the others toward the yard, her heart pounding. 147 people stood together in the cold air. Field hands came in from the cotton rows, still holding hoes and sacks. House slaves stepped out from the big house, wearing better clothes passed down from the Whitfields. Children came from the quarters, clutching their mothers' skirts. Everyone felt that something terrible was coming. Master Whitfield stood on the porch, his face dark with rage. Mistress Constance stood beside him, looking calm and pleased. Overseer Sutton leaned against the whipping post, his whip already in hand. And in the middle of the yard stood Samuel, 12 years old, shaking, a dark bruise forming on his cheek. Patience felt the cold rush through her blood. She wanted to run to him, but she stayed still, knowing any reaction would only make things worse. Master Whitfield spoke loudly into the silence. "This boy," he said, pointing at Samuel, "has destroyed valuable property. A porcelain vase brought from China by my grandfather, worth more than this boy's useless hide, has been broken because of his carelessness." The vase, Patience later learned, had been on a high shelf in the library. Samuel had been dusting below it when his elbow knocked a book, which hit the shelf and caused the vase to fall. It was a simple accident, something that could happen to anyone, but enslaved people were not allowed accidents. "I will not allow my property to be destroyed," Whitfield went on. "This boy is too clumsy and foolish for housework. He needs to learn hard labor in the fields. But first, he must learn what happens when you break what belongs to me." Patience's heart raced so fast she thought it would burst. A whipping was coming. Samuel was only 12, small for his age. She had seen grown men nearly die from such punishment. But what Whitfield said next was far worse. "Sutton, give him 25 lashes," he ordered. "Then, since he is useless in the house and I have no need for a field hand who can't handle simple tasks, I am selling him. Jeremiah Blackwood will arrive this afternoon to take him to Louisiana. Good riddance to bad property." The word struck Patience like a blow. Selling him. Taking Samuel far south, where she would never see him again, where sugar plantations worked people to death. A sound escaped her throat before she could stop it. A small cry of pain. Heads turned toward her. Whitfield's eyes locked onto her place in the crowd. "Who made that noise?" he demanded. No one moved. Patience felt frozen. "I said, who made that noise?" he shouted. "If no one speaks, I'll have Sutton whip every one of you until someone does." Old Moses stepped forward, his voice steady. "Master, I believe it was Patience, sir. The boy Samuel is her son." Patience felt both gratitude and anger. He saved the others, but now all attention fell on her. "Patience," Whitfield said coldly, "step forward." She moved on weak legs until she stood beside Samuel, careful not to look at him, knowing she would fall apart if she did. "You dare question my decision?" Whitfield said quietly, which was more frightening than yelling. "No, master," Patience whispered, eyes on the ground. "I am sorry, master, it was just a sound. You did not mean to object to me selling my own property." Whitfield snapped. "You forget your place. You forget that you do not own this boy. I do. He is mine to do. His life belongs to me. His future belongs to me. You have no power here. None at all. Do you understand?" "Yes, master." Patience spoke the words like something bitter burning her mouth. "Good. Then you will stand right there and watch while I show your boy what happens to careless, useless slaves." He gave Sutton a small nod. "Begin." 2 field hands were told to take Samuel to the post. They tied his wrists high and pulled off his shirt, showing his narrow back, his ribs clear beneath his skin. He was trembling now, tears pouring down his cheeks, yet he made no sound. Patience had trained him well. Crying only made things worse. Pain shown was pain multiplied. The first lash cut across Samuel's back. His body jumped hard, but he clenched a rag someone had kindly pushed between his teeth. The second lash crossed the first and blood appeared. The third, the fourth, the fifth. Each sharp crack filled the yard loud in the heavy silence. Patience forced herself to keep watching. She forced her eyes to stay open. She forced her mind to hold every detail, the calm look on Master Whitfield's face, the cold pleasure shining in Mistress Constance's eyes, the steady practiced motion of Sutton's arm as he pulled back and struck again and again. By the 10th lash Samuel's back was torn and raw. By the 15th his body sagged, hanging from his tied arms. By the 25th he no longer moved. They finally untied him and dumped a bucket of salt water over his back to clean the wounds. Samuel woke with a scream that would live inside Patience forever. They dragged him away and left him face down on the dirt floor of cabin 17. Patience was not allowed to go to him. She was sent back to the garden beds. The next 4 hours passed like a dream she could not escape. Her hands worked without thought while her mind shattered inside. She did not cry. Tears were forbidden. Grief was treated as rebellion. She did not shout or fight. Anger would have earned her the whip or worse. She only worked, silent, obedient, empty. At 1 in the afternoon a wagon rolled in. Jeremiah Blackwood had arrived. He was a slave trader who made his money buying people in the Upper South and selling them farther down, where cotton and sugar demanded endless bodies. He was a heavy man with slick hair and breath thick with whiskey and tobacco. He looked Samuel over the way someone studies livestock. He pulled open his mouth to check his teeth, squeezed his arms and legs, judging strength, ignoring the fresh wounds on his back. "He's small," Blackwood said, "and you've hurt him. I'll give $600. Not more. He's 12 and bright," Whitfield replied. "He'll grow." 800. They agreed on 700. Money passed hands. Papers were signed. In that moment Samuel belonged to someone new. Patience was given exactly 2 minutes to say goodbye. Samuel could barely stand. Blood still soaked through the rough shirt thrown on him. Heavy chains circled his ankles, linked to 8 other enslaved people Blackwood had bought nearby. They would walk to Natchez, board a steamboat, travel down to New Orleans and be sold again, likely to sugar fields where few lived long. 2 minutes, 120 seconds to lose her son forever. She held his face between her hands. So many words crowded her chest. She wanted to tell him she loved him more than breath. She wanted to tell him to live, to endure, to remember himself. She wanted to speak of his grandmother the Queen, of their people, their songs, their stories, all the wisdom she had tried to give him. But her throat closed and only a few words came. "Remember. Remember everything. You are royal blood. You are not what they say you are." Samuel nodded, tears running freely. "Mama," he whispered. It was the last word she would ever hear from him. Blackwood jerked the chain and Samuel stumbled forward. The line began to move. 9 chained souls walking south toward the river and a future that almost surely meant death. Patience stood in the yard and watched until they vanished. She stayed standing as the sun crossed the sky. She stayed as others returned to work. She stayed as evening came and the cold of February deepened. Mistress Constance finally stepped outside and said flatly, "Get back to work, Patience. Your boy is gone and there is nothing you can do. Be grateful I don't sell you to just to remind you of your place." Something inside Patience gave way. Not with a sharp break, but with a slow final collapse, like a tree long rotting at the core. The part of her that endured and hoped died there. What remained was colder, quieter, and fixed on one purpose. She returned to her cabin. Rose and Dina tried to comfort her, but their voices barely reached her. That night she lay staring upward as something changed within her. 31 years she had survived. 31 years she had waited for freedom. No more. Before dawn she rose and moved softly to the woods where Aunt Chloe was buried. She knelt and spoke to the spirits in mixed Yoruba and English, words her mother had taught her. She called to her grandmother Queen, to her stolen mother, to all who had suffered and died in chains. She asked for strength, for wisdom, for rage. The air seemed to shift around her. She opened the red flannel bag at her neck and took out 3 things. A small bone from Aunt Chloe's hand, a paper with names written carefully, a lock of Samuel's hair saved from his first cutting. She buried them at the grave and made her vow, Master Cornelius Whitfield, Mistress Constance Whitfield, Overseer Marcus Sutton, Jupiter and Caesar who turned on their own, and all who stood beside them. By my ancestors, by my son's blood, by my years of pain they will pay. They will know fear, they will know pain, they will know death. I will be free or I will die, but I will never be a slave again." The wind moved through the trees as if carrying her words away. Something answered in the dark, whether spirit or heart she did not know. She returned to her cabin as dawn broke. Rose and Dina slept. Patience lay down, and for the first time since Samuel was taken, she slept. She dreamed of bees. In the weeks that followed, Patience began to watch, not with the careful fear slaves learned, but with the calm focus of a hunter. She studied Master Whitfield's days closely. He woke at 7 each morning. Breakfast at 7:30, eggs, bacon, grits, biscuits, coffee with cream and sugar. Mornings in his office with books and letters. Lunch at 1, simple foods. Afternoons riding the fields on horseback. Dinner at 7, heavy and rich, wine or bourbon. Evenings in the library or with guests. Bed at 11, always the same. Powerful men lived by habit because they believed nothing could touch them. She studied Mistress Constance as well. She rose at 8, breakfast at 8:30, mornings directing house slaves, planning meals. Lunch at 1. Afternoons sewing, writing or visiting. Dinner at 7, evenings with piano or scripture. Bed at 10:30. She watched Overseer Sutton. He rose at 5:30, always there when the bell rang at 6. He rode the fields all day, whip close, eyes sharp for any pause. He ate alone in the kitchen house served by Martha. He lived between the big house and the quarters to watch both. Most nights he drank hard, sitting on his porch firing his pistol at whatever caught his eye. She watched Jupiter and Caesar, the drivers. They rose with the others but quickly took their places as enforcers, pushing people forward, reporting any delay, using violence to prove their power. They ate better food and avoided the worst labor, and they guarded their small privileges fiercely. They were given small comforts and slept in their own cabin instead of sharing crowded spaces with many families. For these small advantages, they had turned against their own people, and because of that, they were hated. She watched patiently and remembered everything, every habit, every routine, every weak point. She noticed that Master Whitfield often stayed alone in his office for long hours, that Mistress Constance sent the house slaves away from her sitting room during afternoon tea, because she wanted to be alone, that Sutton drank heavily and became slow and careless in the evenings. She saw that Jupiter and Caesar often separated, each overseeing different work groups, and that the Whitfields hosted guests every Saturday night, repeating the same social customs with perfect predictability. But watching was only the beginning. She needed a plan, and that plan came to her one afternoon in early March as she stood near her beehives, observing thousands of bees moving in complex paths, each one part of a larger mind, each one ready to die to protect the hive. She had cared for these hives for 23 years. She knew each colony closely, which ones were aggressive, which were calm, which produced the most honey, which were growing fast and would soon need more space. The bees trusted her. When she opened a hive to check the frames or collect honey, she rarely used the smoke that other keepers depended on. She moved with care and purpose, and the bees accepted her as belonging there. But she also knew something about bees that no one else at Magnolia Grove understood, something her mother had taught her, wisdom passed down through generations of African beekeepers. Bees could be trained to attack on command. With careful preparation, proper control of their instincts, and the right trigger of their defense, a swarm of angry bees could become a weapon more powerful than any gun. One sting hurt but rarely killed. But when a full hive attacked, 40,000 bees at once, each able to sting, each releasing scent signals that called others to strike the same target, the outcome was devastating. Hundreds of stings could throw a person into shock. Thousands could end a life. She had 5 hives, nearly 200,000 bees under her care. She began her work quietly, making no sudden moves that might raise suspicion. Over several weeks, she relocated the hives one at a time from near the orchard to a new spot closer to the big house. She explained to Master Whitfield that the bees would have better access to magnolia trees and garden flowers there, which would improve the quality of the honey. Whitfield, proud of his knowledge of farming, agreed without question. By late April, all 5 hives stood in the garden behind the big house, placed within 30 feet of the structure. 3 faced the back door, two were angled toward the dining room windows. Then she slowly began to irritate the colonies. This had to be done carefully, building their defensiveness little by little without pushing them to abandon the hive. She caused small disturbances, gently shaking the boxes at dusk, introducing strange smells, narrowing the entrances so the bees felt threatened. She never went too far. She needed them angry, but she needed them to stay where they were. She also began gathering certain plants and roots. Oleander grew all over the plantation. Its white and pink flowers admired for beauty, though every part of the plant was poisonous. She picked the leaves and washed her hands carefully afterward. She collected Jimson weed from the creek banks, recognizing its trumpet-shaped blooms. She found foxglove in a shaded patch near the woods and water hemlock near the river's marshy edges. She dried each plant, crushed them into powder with creek stones, and stored them in small cloth bags hidden beneath the floor of her cabin. Rose and Dinah did not ask questions. They had seen the change in her since Samuel was taken and understood the signs of someone practicing hoodoo. They stayed silent and looked away. In early May, she learned that Master Whitfield was planning a large celebration in August. He intended to buy 20 enslaved people from a plantation in Virginia. The purchase would raise Magnolia Grove's enslaved population to 167 and would be paid for with a loan based on higher cotton production. Whitfield bragged to other planters that this deal would make him one of the biggest slave owners in Wilkinson County. He announced a dinner party on August 17th to mark the occasion. He invited 3 neighboring planters and their wives, men with similar wealth and land. The event would be grand, meant to show off his success and secure his place among Mississippi's elite. When she heard this, everything fell into place. A celebration meant many targets all gathered together. It would happen in the evening, after dark, when escape would be harder. It was the perfect moment. She had 4 months to get ready, and she used every single day. She studied the big house carefully. The dining room had 4 large windows that were often opened in summer for air. The kitchen was a separate building connected by a covered walkway, designed to prevent fire and heat from spreading. The front door faced the drive. The back door opened into the garden where the hives now stood. The dining room fireplace was sometimes used even in summer when nights grew cool. There were 2 other fireplaces, one in the library and one in the upstairs bedroom. Each had a chimney rising above the roof, all connected by flues that allowed air to move through the house. She mapped every entrance and exit, the front door that was locked at night, the back door, the kitchen entrance, the windows in every main room and upstairs bedroom, the cellar door used for food storage. She counted them, pictured them, planned for each one. She watched which house slaves would work during the dinner. Martha would cook in the kitchen. A young woman named Lily would serve at the table. Jupiter's wife, Chloe, disliked for her husband's loyalty to the masters, would assist. She herself would likely be asked to bring honey and fruit from the garden. That meant she would be allowed inside the big house at the most important time, without raising suspicion. In June, she tested how the bees reacted to different triggers. Smoke calmed them, but certain smells made them furious. Crushing a single bee and releasing its alarm scent near a hive caused instant defense. Loud sounds, vibrations, and sudden movement increased their aggression. Most important, she confirmed what her mother had taught her, that disturbing several hives at the same time caused a unified, unstoppable attack. She also measured how far the danger reached. In full defense, bees would chase targets for a quarter mile, but their strongest attack stayed within 100 feet. The dining room was only 50 feet from the nearest hive. Everyone inside would be trapped in that zone. In July, she prepared the final steps. She needed a way to send the bees straight into the house. The chimneys offered the answer. If she forced the bees down through them, they would pour out of the fireplaces into occupied rooms. She planned to use cloth bags, filling each with angry bees from a hive, tying them closed, climbing to the roof, and releasing them down the chimneys at the same moment. Confused and enraged, the bees would follow the air downward. Inside, they would attack heat and breath, meaning every living person. A ladder would draw attention, so she found another way. A large magnolia tree stood close to the house. its branches strong enough to hold her weight and near enough to the roof. She practiced climbing from tree to roof at night until she could do it silently. She planned her escape. When the attack began, she would be on the roof. She would climb down, run to the back of the land, cross the cotton fields, enter the woods, follow the creek south to the Mississippi River, swim across in the dark, and move north toward Natchez. She had heard of a house there, possibly part of the Underground Railroad, run by a white Quaker family. She did not know if it was true, but it was her only hope. She prepared supplies: dried meat, cornmeal, a small knife stolen from the kitchen, flint for fire, a blanket. She hid them in a hollow tree near the woods, wrapped in oilcloth to keep them dry. Everything was ready. She also prepared herself for death. She visited Aunt Chloe's grave, asking the spirits to receive her if she failed. She asked them to carry her soul home, back to Africa, back to her mother. She prayed for Samuel's safety and strength wherever he was. She asked for courage to finish what she had begun. By early August, everything was in place. The bees were more aggressive than they had ever been. The anger had existed for a very long time, packed tight like something dangerous sealed inside wooden crates. The plant toxins were ready. The way out had already been mapped. Every detail of the plan had been settled. She had practiced each step again and again in her thoughts until it felt like memory instead of imagination. She waited for August 17th. The waiting felt endless and instant at the same time. Each day crawled by slowly, painful in how similar it was to the one before. Yet somehow the weeks rushed past, and suddenly it was August 15th, then August 16th, and then the morning of the 17th arrived, and she knew nothing would ever be the same again. That morning, the other enslaved people woke with a calm that surprised her. She had expected fear to rise inside her, but fear had been burned away by 6 months of careful planning and 31 years of pain. What was left was sharp and clear: purpose, control, complete focus. She followed her morning routine exactly as she always did. She ate her cornmeal without haste. She gathered her tools as usual. She walked to the gardens and began her tasks. To anyone watching, she was no different from any other day: quiet, obedient, hardworking. No one could see that beneath her calm surface she was counting the hours until everything came due. The day was heavy with heat and moisture, the kind of August weather Mississippi was known for. By noon, the temperature pushed toward 95 degrees. The sky was empty of clouds, and the sun showed no mercy. By afternoon, everyone on the plantation moved slowly, looking for shade, dreading the work that continued no matter how hot it became. At 4 in the afternoon, she was called to the kitchen house. Mistress Constance wanted honey and fresh fruit for the evening meal. She collected a jar of honey from her supplies and picked peaches, figs, and blackberries from the orchard. She carried them to Martha in the kitchen. Martha was 70 years old and had lived in bondage her entire life. She had cooked for the Whitfield family for 35 years. The meal she was preparing was large and impressive: roasted duck, ham, potatoes, green beans from the garden, biscuits, and several desserts. The heat from the fires was cruel, and sweat ran down Martha's face as she worked. "Big doings tonight," Martha said quietly as the fruit was set down. "Master wants to impress all them rich white folks, acting like he's royalty." She nodded but stayed silent. Martha studied her for a long moment. "You been different since they sold your boy," Martha said gently. "Quiet, but not scared quiet. Quiet like you waiting on something." She met Martha's eyes. "We're all waiting on something," she said softly. "Waiting on freedom, waiting on justice, waiting on the Lord." Martha held her gaze and something passed between them without words. Then the old woman nodded slowly. "Amen. The Lord works in ways we don't always see." She left the kitchen and went back to her cabin. Rose and Dina were there, fixing their small evening meal. They looked at her as she came in. "You going to do it?" Rose asked. It was not really a question. "I don't know what you mean," she replied without thinking. "Yes, you do," Dina said quietly. "And we know too. We ain't blind. We seen you watching. We seen you working. We know that look." Her heart raced. If they told anyone, everything would fall apart. "We ain't saying nothing," Rose said quickly. "Whatever you planning, we won't stop you. We won't tell. They took your boy. They take all our children. They take everything." You do what you got to do. We'll say we saw nothing, heard nothing, knew nothing." Tears burned her eyes, the first she had allowed since Samuel was taken. "Thank you," she whispered. "You do it for all of us," Dina said. "For every child sold, every whipping, every single thing they done to us. Make them pay." As the sun dropped low, the guests arrived. She watched from the garden as 3 carriages rolled up to the big house. Nathaniel Caldwell and his wife Sarah from Oakhill, Montgomery Rutherford and his wife Virginia from Riverside, Thurston Hampton and his wife Magnolia from Greenwood. All wealthy, all slave owners, all dressed in fine clothes for a celebration built on suffering. Master Whitfield welcomed them warmly, shaking hands and bowing, guiding them inside with practiced manners. Mistress Constance stood beside him, smiling as the perfect hostess. Lotter floated across the lawn. Through the windows, she could see them drinking bourbon and wine in the parlor. At 7, dinner was announced. The guests took their seats at the long table. Lily and Chloe served the first course. As planned, she was called to bring in the honey and fruit for dessert. She entered with a silver tray, eyes lowered, every movement proper and controlled. She placed the items down, dipped into a small curtsy, and waited. "Excellent honey, as always," Master Whitfield said without looking at her. "Very useful skill. You may go." She left calmly, heading toward the kitchen, then slipped into the shadows of the garden. Night had fallen. The air was still warm, and the dining room windows were open. She could hear their voices clearly. Plates clinked. Lauder rose. Master Whitfield talked about expanding cotton fields. Mistress Constance complained about house servants. The other men agreed, sharing stories of punishment and pride, praising themselves for their power. She moved quietly to the tool shed and retrieved what she had hidden earlier, 5 strong cloth bags. A small lidded pot holding crushed honeycomb mixed with alarm scent from bees she had crushed that afternoon. She approached the first hive. The bees were already angry from the heat and her earlier work. She placed the pot near the entrance, lightly smoked it just enough to confuse them, then worked quickly. Transfer Sewell. Over and over she had practiced this many times. In minutes, the first bag held thousands of furious bees. She repeated the process until all 5 bags were full. Her hands trembled from excitement, not fear. She had been stung, but barely noticed. She carried the bags to the magnolia tree and looked up at the branches stretching toward the house. She breathed deeply. This was the point where nothing could be undone. She thought of Samuel, her mother. 31 years in chains, every beating, every family torn apart, every cruelty committed by the people now laughing below. She climbed. The bark scraped her hands. She tested each branch, moving slowly, silent as breath. The bags hung from leather straps across her shoulders. The buzzing was muted. She reached the branch near the roof, pulled herself up, and crawled toward the chimneys. She could hear the toast being made below, glasses clinking in celebration. She opened the first bag and emptied it into the dining room chimney. Bees poured down into darkness. She repeated it again and again. Then she pulled out 3 small cloth bundles filled with crushed bees, an alarm scent, the strongest signal of danger she could make, and prepared for the final step. She used a substance that triggered bee aggression. She dropped one into each chimney. The result came almost at once. From inside the house she heard a scream, then another, then many voices shouting in fear and confusion. Soon the sounds blended together into nonstop cries of panic. The bees, confused by their fall down the chimneys, poured out of the fireplaces into the dining room, the library, and the bedroom. The alarm scent she had released told them danger was near and that they must defend themselves. The warmth and breath of the people below marked them as threats. Thousands of African honeybees swarmed through the rooms, each sting calling more bees to attack the same person. They rushed at the 8 people gathered in the dining room with relentless force. She heard chairs and tables crashing over. Glass shattered as people tried to flee through windows. She heard Mistress Constance scream, the sound ending suddenly. She heard Master Whitfield shouting, then choking, then making broken sounds that no longer sounded human. Guests cried for help, prayed aloud, and begged for mercy that never came. She did not wait. She climbed down from the roof the way she had practiced many times, moving fast rather than quietly. She ran to the back of the house where the main doors were. Using wooden bars she had prepared earlier, she forced the back door shut and wedged it tight so it could not be opened from inside. Then she ran to the front. The front door was already blocked. One of the guests had tried to escape but had fallen in the doorway. His body now blocked the exit while the bees continued their attack. Through the window she could see his face and hands badly swollen and covered with stings. The dining room windows had been broken by people trying to get out, but the bees followed them anyway. 3 people stumbled into the garden, screaming and waving their arms as dark clouds of insects covered them. She recognized Montgomery Rutherford, his wife Virginia, and Nathaniel Caldwell. They ran without direction, crashing into bushes, falling, getting back up, and running again. The bees did not stop. Montgomery made it only a short distance before he fell. His body failed him, and he could no longer breathe. He died struggling on the ground while the bees continued to swarm. Virginia ran toward the slave cabins, perhaps hoping someone would help, or perhaps not thinking at all. She fell, stood again, and fell once more, her white dress stained dark. The third time she fell, near one of the cabins, she did not get back up. The bees covered her completely, moving as one living mass. Nathaniel Caldwell reacted differently. He jumped into the decorative pond and pushed himself underwater, but he had to come up for air. Each time he surfaced, the bees were waiting. After several attempts, he did not rise again. Whether he drowned or died from the stings could not be known. His body floated quietly in the pond as bees drifted around it. Inside the house, the screams slowly faded. She approached one of the broken windows and looked in. The sight was worse than she had imagined. The dining room looked like a place of battle. The table lay overturned. Food and plates were scattered everywhere. Bodies lay where people had fallen, so covered with bees that they barely looked human. The air was thick with movement as thousands of bees still flew through the room, driven by instinct and alarm. Master Cornelius Whitfield lay near the fireplace. His body was badly swollen, his fine clothes torn during his desperate struggle. His face was distorted, his eyes shut tight, his hands frozen in a final attempt to defend himself. He had died in terror, exactly as she intended. Mistress Constance Whitfield had reached the hallway, likely trying to climb the stairs. She lay at the foot of them, one arm stretched upward as if reaching for safety. Her silk dress was soaked, and her face was destroyed by stings, the same face that had once looked at enslaved people with cruelty and pride. Thurston Hampton and his wife Magnolia had tried to hide beneath the dining table. It had not saved them. They lay beside each other, together in death as they had been in life. Their wealth and status had not protected them from nature turned into a weapon by the anger of someone they believed they owned. Sarah Caldwell lay near the sideboard, still holding the jar of honey that had been brought earlier. The meaning was clear. She had been killed by the sweetness taken through suffering and force. 8 people were dead. 8 people who had built their lives on slavery, destroyed by the knowledge and rage of someone they had called property. She stood at the window for a long moment as the bees slowly calmed when there was no longer movement or breath. She felt no happiness, only a cold sense of completion. This was justice. Not the justice of laws written by slave owners, but an older justice, one born from cause and consequence, from the oppressed striking back. She turned away. Lights were coming on in the slave quarters. People stepped outside, drawn by the noise. Shapes moved cautiously as they tried to understand what had happened. She knew she had to leave. She had very little time before the full truth was discovered. She ran through the garden toward the woods, passing her beehives. Most of the bees were gone, but a few remained and buzzed softly as she passed, knowing her scent. She reached the cotton fields and looked back once. The big house stood silent, windows broken, laughter gone. Only darkness remained. She turned and ran into the fields, heading south toward the creek, toward the woods, toward the river, toward freedom or death, but never back to slavery. Behind her, shouts rose as people found the bodies. She heard voices calling out in shock. Someone shouted that the bell should be rung to warn nearby plantations, but she was already deep among the rows, moving easily through land she had worked for 23 years. She knew every path and ditch. She reached the creek and followed it south, retrieving her hidden supplies from a hollow tree without stopping. Dogs barked in the distance, but she scattered her prepared mixture of peppers and herbs to confuse them. It would not stop the dogs forever, but it would buy her time. By midnight she had traveled many miles. She reached the Mississippi River, where the bank was lower and the current slower. She removed her dress so it would not drag her down, tied her bundle to her head, and stepped into the water. The river was wide and strong, cold even in summer. She had learned to swim long ago and prayed her body still remembered. She swam at an angle, letting the current carry her while she pushed toward the far shore. The water was dark. She focused on breathing and movement, on the faint lights across the river. After a long struggle she reached the opposite bank. Exhausted, shaking, she rested briefly before moving inland to hide among trees and brush. She had crossed into Louisiana, but she was not yet free. The law could still drag her back. True freedom would require reaching farther north or finding people willing to risk everything to hide her. She knew the road ahead was still long. Natchez, about 20 miles north of where she had crossed the river, was known as a place where several Quaker families lived. People whispered about for helping runaway slaves. Getting to Natchez meant turning back north, straight toward the pursuit she knew would soon follow her. Even so, it was the best option she had. She spent the rest of the night moving through the thick Louisiana wilderness, keeping far from roads and settlements, guiding herself by the stars whenever the trees opened enough to show the sky. She was starving, worn out, and terrified, yet she felt more alive than she ever had in her 31 years. At Magnolia Grove, daylight revealed the true horror of what had happened the night before. When the first nearby planters arrived after hearing the alarm, they stepped into a scene that would be talked about across the South for many years. The main house stood unnaturally quiet. A body blocked the front door. The back door was jammed tight. Windows were shattered. Inside, 8 bodies lay scattered in different positions. Each one was so badly stung that they were barely recognizable as human. Thousands of dead bees covered the floors, the walls, and the bodies themselves. A few living bees still crawled weakly, their venom gone, their task finished. The planters stood frozen in the dining room, shocked and sickened. Jeremiah Blackwood, the slave trader who had bought Samuel, was there among them. He stared at Cornelius Whitfield's body and slowly shook his head. He said he had seen men die from bee stings before, 1 or 2 at a time, but never anything like this. This was not an accident. It was something far worse. Sheriff Thomas Peaton of Woodville, Cornelius Whitfield's nephew, was called to the plantation. As he studied the house, his anger grew and understanding slowly formed. He pointed to the chimneys and told them to look at how many bees were gathered near the fireplaces. Someone had dropped them down the chimneys. This had been planned. This was murder. He turned toward the enslaved people who had been forced into the yard under armed guard and demanded to know who took care of the bees. At first there was only silence. Then old Moses spoke up carefully. He said it was Patience who managed the hives. When the sheriff asked where she was, silence fell again. After a moment, Rose stepped forward and said Patience had been there the night before and had brought honey into the house for dinner, but no one had seen her since. They did not know where she went. The sheriff's face darkened with rage. He ordered her cabin searched, then ordered everything searched. They found the cabin empty. They found signs of careful planning, hidden supplies, missing items, clear proof that Patience had been preparing for something. Every enslaved person on the plantation was questioned, but no one admitted knowing anything. The silence held strong. The sheriff then organized a massive manhunt. 50 armed white men, 20 bloodhounds, horses, supplies, the largest search Wilkinson County had seen in years. They followed her trail to the creek, tracked her south, discovered the pepper mixture she had used to confuse the dogs, and cursed her cleverness. By mid-morning they reached the Mississippi River and realized she had crossed it. The search spread into Louisiana. Slave patrols were alerted within a 100-mile radius. Wanted posters were printed and handed out. The reward was set at $1,000, a huge amount, showing both her value as property and the desperate need to capture her and make her an example. The posters described a runaway slave named Patience, A black woman about 38 years old, around 5 feet 4 inches tall, thin, with old whip scars on her back. She was labeled extremely dangerous and blamed for the deaths of 8 white people at Magnolia Grove Plantation in Wilkinson County, Mississippi. The notice warned that she had knowledge of poisons and other dangerous skills and should be approached with caution. But Patience was already far away, moving through the Louisiana wilderness with the instincts of someone who had survived slavery for 31 years and refused to be taken again. For 3 weeks she avoided capture. She traveled mostly at night and hid during the day. She stayed off roads and away from towns. She survived by gathering nuts, berries, and roots she recognized from her knowledge of plants. She caught fish from streams using small traps made from sticks and vines, a method her mother had once shown her. She drank from creeks and springs. She slept inside hollow logs deep in thick brush, anywhere she could stay hidden. Those weeks were filled with suffering. Hunger never left her. She lost weight quickly as her body burned itself for energy. She collected cuts from thorns, bruises from falls, and blisters from endless walking. Insects and leeches bit her. She nearly stepped on a copperhead snake and pulled back just in time. She became sick from dirty water and spent 2 days feverish and confused, hiding in a cave, certain she would not survive. Still she lived. Slowly and painfully, she kept moving north. On the 23rd day after the killings, she reached the edges of Natchez. She knew she could not walk openly into town. A lone black woman without papers would be seized immediately. But she had heard of a Quaker family named Morrison who lived 3 miles east of Natchez, and were said to help fugitives. She watched their farm for 2 full days before making contact. She saw a middle-aged white man and woman working their land themselves, with no enslaved people in sight. She saw them caring for chickens, tending a garden, living simply. In the evenings, she saw the man reading from a Bible. These signs gave her hope. On the 3rd night, she approached the house after dark and knocked softly. Thomas Morrison opened the door holding a lantern. He took one look at Patience, dirty, thin, dressed in rags, clearly a runaway, and showed no shock. He quietly told her to come inside quickly because it was not safe outside. Patience nearly collapsed as she entered. Elizabeth Morrison immediately brought her food and water. They asked no questions at first. They simply helped. Thomas later told her they knew exactly who she was. Everyone in the region was talking about Magnolia Grove, about 8 dead, about a slave woman who used bees as weapons, about the biggest manhunt anyone could remember. Patience looked at them with tired eyes and asked if they were going to turn her in. Elizabeth answered firmly that they would not. They were Quakers, she said, and believed slavery was a sin. They had already helped 17 fugitives reach freedom. Patience would be the 18th. Tears streamed down Patience's face, the first she had allowed since the night she made her choice at Aunt Chloe's grave. She whispered that they had taken her son and sold him away. She could not allow them to live after that. Thomas Morrison nodded and said they did not support violence, but they understood how deeply she had suffered and would not judge her. For now she needed safety. They hid her in a concealed room beneath the house, built especially for fugitives, and reached through a trap door hidden under a kitchen rug. They brought her food, clean clothes, and water. They treated her wounds and sickness and began planning her journey north through the Underground Railroad. But events soon turned against them. On September 12, 1856, 3 weeks after Patience arrived, a professional slave catcher named Silas Crow came to the Morrison door. He had been hired by Sheriff Petton and was known for his skill. He tracked Patience by following rumors, sightings, and careful questioning, and he had heard talk of the Morrisons' beliefs. Thomas Morrison answered the door calmly. Crow said he was searching for a runaway woman named Patience and asked if any unfamiliar black people had been seen nearby. Thomas truthfully replied that he had seen none. Crow studied him and asked to search the property. Thomas refused, saying it was private land and Crow had no warrant. That refusal confirmed Crow's suspicions. Crow left but stayed close, watching the farm from a nearby hill. After 2 days, he saw Elizabeth Morrison carrying more food than 2 people would need. That night, Crow returned with Sheriff Petton and armed men. They surrounded the house and forced their way inside. They searched carefully and soon found the trapdoor beneath the rug. Patience heard them coming and understood her escape had ended. When they opened the hidden space, she stood tall, holding a knife, calm and unafraid. She spoke clearly, giving her name, declaring who she was, and taking responsibility for what she had done at Magnolia Grove. They pulled her from the cellar and chained her wrists and ankles with heavy iron. Thomas and Elizabeth Morrison were arrested as well, charged with hiding a fugitive slave. They were later convicted and sentenced to 2 years in prison. Patience was taken back to Wilkinson County in a wagon cage, displayed like an animal. Word spread quickly, and crowds gathered in every town they passed through. Some people came only to mock her and shout threats. Others came as well, enslaved people who were allowed or forced to watch. They stood quietly as she walked past, and in their eyes there was something different, something deeper than fear. It looked like respect, pride, and a small spark of hope. She was kept in the Woodville jail for 2 weeks while officials prepared for a trial. The trial itself was nothing more than a show and lasted less than 3 hours. She was never allowed to speak in her own defense. Enslaved people were forbidden by Mississippi law to testify against white people. The court presented its evidence: the bodies of the dead, the chimneys that had been opened, witnesses who claimed they saw her bring honey to the house that night. Others spoke about her knowledge of beekeeping. There was testimony about her son being sold away. The outcome had already been decided before the trial even began. She was found guilty on 8 counts of murder. The punishment was just as certain: death by hanging. The execution would be public, meant to warn other enslaved people about the price of resistance. The date was set for October 3, 1856. Patience was given 2 weeks left to live. During those 2 weeks, something surprising happened. An abolitionist from Boston arrived, a journalist named William Garrison. He was not related to William Lloyd Garrison, but he deeply admired him. Garrison had read about the case in newspapers and believed it could expose the brutal truth of slavery to people in the North. The local authorities allowed the interview because they felt confident. They believed Patience would be shown as a monster, proof that enslaved people were dangerous and needed strict control. But William Garrison knew how to listen, and Patience told him everything. She spoke about being taken from Africa as a child, about surviving the Middle Passage, about living 31 years in slavery. She told him about her children who had been sold away or had died. She spoke of Samuel, the broken vase, the 25 lashes, and the sail to Louisiana. She explained the knowledge her mother had passed down to her, the 6 months of planning, and the night of August 17th when everything changed. Garrison wrote every word carefully and truthfully. He sent the story to abolitionist newspapers across the North. Her story, 31 Years Lived in Chains, was published in the Liberator, the North Star, and many other papers. It was printed again in pamphlets and spread widely. For many people in the North, the article was shocking. It was the first time they truly faced what slavery meant, not as a distant political argument, but as real human suffering. The image of a mother watching her 12-year-old son beaten and sold, then using old knowledge to take terrible revenge, stayed in people's minds. Abolitionist support grew stronger, donations increased. Her case became a symbol. Phrases like "Remember Patience" and "Justice for Patience" appeared on signs and in speeches. In the South, the reaction was anger mixed with fear. The idea that one enslaved woman had killed 8 white people, including powerful plantation owners, terrified those who supported slavery. New laws were passed, making life even harsher for enslaved people. Gatherings were banned. Teaching slaves to read was made punishable by death. Patrols were increased. Plantations tightened security. Food was tasted before meals. Doors were locked and people were watched closely. Beneath all of this control was fear. If one woman could do this, what if others tried the same? On the morning of October 3, 1856, Patience was taken from her cell to the town square in Woodville. A gallows stood waiting. By law, executions of enslaved people had to be public, meant to punish and to scare others. Thousands gathered. White citizens came to see what they called justice, to reassure themselves that order had been restored. Enslaved people were also brought, forced by their owners to watch. They stood under guard in assigned areas, made to see one of their own killed as a warning. Patience was led up the steps. She wore a plain white dress given by the jailer's wife, who had been touched by her story despite herself. Her hands were tied behind her back, her ankles chained. A preacher offered to pray with her, but she refused. She said she had already made peace with God and her ancestors and needed no one to stand between them. The sheriff read the charges and the sentence, then offered her a final chance to speak. This was tradition, meant to make her accept guilt and warn others not to follow her path. Patience looked out at the crowd. She saw white faces filled with anger and satisfaction. She saw black faces filled with sorrow and something stronger, something bold. She saw children of both races watching, learning lessons that would shape their lives. She spoke clearly and loudly so all could hear. She said her name was Patience, and before that she had been a Bini, daughter of Queen Afema of the Yoruba people. She told them she had been stolen at 7 years old, survived the Middle Passage, and lived 31 years as property. She said she had given birth to 5 children and had 4 taken from her. Her son Samuel had been sold at 12 years old for breaking a vase, valued at $700. She said she was told she had no rights as a mother or as a human being. She admitted she had used the knowledge of her ancestors to kill 8 people and said she did not regret it. They were not innocent, she said. They built their lives on suffering, abused women, beat men, and sold children, calling it their right. She called it evil. She said they called her a murderer, but she called herself a mother protecting her child the only way left to her. They called her a criminal, but she called herself a human being demanding justice when the law gave none. She said this execution might teach a lesson. Some might learn to obey, but others might learn that dying with dignity is better than living in chains, and that one brave person can shake injustice. She said she was not afraid. She had made her choice 6 months earlier at the grave of a wise woman who told her the spirits would guide her. She prayed her son would survive and remember her. She said she was returning to her ancestors and reminded the enslaved people to remember their worth and humanity. Chains could bind the body, she said, but not the soul unless it was allowed. She spoke of Cornelius Whitfield dying in terror, realizing the person he had mistreated had destroyed him, and said that knowledge was worth more than another lifetime of slavery. She said she died free in spirit, a victory no one could steal. The sheriff, furious, moved to stop her, but she had finished. The noose was placed around her neck. She refused the hood, saying she wanted to see the sky and the sun, not darkness. The trap door opened and she fell. Her neck broke instantly. Her body swayed in the cool October air. In the crowd, a woman softly began to sing a spiritual Patience had loved. Others joined, their voices rising despite guards trying to silence them. The song spread, carrying the message that her spirit could not be killed. After an hour, her body was taken down and buried in an unmarked grave in the colored section of the cemetery. Authorities believed the story would end there. It did not. Her story traveled quickly through enslaved communities, carried by secret networks from plantation to plantation. Songs gained new verses that told her tale. The woman who called the bees became a legend, whispered at night, passed from mothers to daughters as proof that resistance was possible. Within a year, similar acts occurred in other states. Though officials tried to hide the truth, the story spread. Abolitionists in the North used her case as proof of slavery's cruelty. Frederick Douglass spoke of her. Harriet Beecher Stowe wrote a story inspired by her. In the South, plantation owners lived in fear, guarding themselves and watching closely, knowing they had underestimated those they enslaved. Magnolia Grove Plantation never recovered, and the shadow of Patience's story never faded. The plantation was sold at auction to settle debts. The new owner, a speculator from New Orleans, quickly realized it was impossible to maintain slaves there. People feared the place, believing it was cursed, that the spirit of Patience still roamed the grounds. The plantation changed hands 3 more times before the Civil War, never turning a profit again, and was eventually abandoned. Today, only overgrown foundations remain, along with a historical marker that makes no mention of Patience or what happened on August 17, 1856. The 5 beehives that Patience had cared for were destroyed immediately after the massacre. The bees were killed with fire and smoke, though some survived, and their descendants still live in the woods of Mississippi. Local beekeepers sometimes speak of an unusually aggressive strain of bees in Wilkinson County, bees that guard their hives with fierce intensity. They call them Patience's bees, although most people do not know the origin of the name. In 1861, 5 years after Patience's execution, the Civil War began. By 1863, President Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring all enslaved people in Confederate territory to be free. In 1865, the 13th Amendment abolished slavery across the United States. 4 million enslaved people were freed. Yet the journey toward true freedom and equality continues more than 160 years later. The legacy of slavery remains, showing up in systemic racism, economic inequality, mass incarceration, and many other ways. The struggle that Patience fought with bees continues in courtrooms, at voting booths, in streets, and within the hearts of people. But her story survives as a reminder of profound truths: that humans will resist oppression no matter the cost, that knowledge and intelligence can overcome brute force, that a mother's love can surpass even fear of death, and that one courageous person can inspire thousands. Justice, even if delayed and imperfect, will eventually arrive. Patience was 38 years old when she died. She had been enslaved for 31 years, from age 7 until her death. She spent 6 months carefully planning her revenge. She was truly free for just 23 days between the night of the massacre and her capture. 23 days of freedom after 31 years of bondage. By any measure it was not enough, yet she chose those 23 days of freedom over a lifetime of submission. In that choice, she reclaimed her humanity and dignity. We remember Patience not to glorify violence, but because she lived in a system so cruel, so dehumanizing, so evil that it drove a mother to desperate action. We remember her because her story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about American history and the foundations of this nation. We remember her because she refused to be invisible, refused to be treated as property, refused to accept the role society forced upon her. And we remember her because, when the law offered no protection and society denied her humanity, she made a choice: I will not die a slave. I will not live without dignity. I will not accept this as my fate. Whatever the consequences, I will act. That decision to claim one's own humanity in the face of a system designed to deny it is worth remembering, not as a guide for behavior, but as a testament to the unbreakable human spirit and a reminder that oppression always meets resistance from those it seeks to crush. Patience's story is American history. It is a story of resistance and rebellion that rarely appears in textbooks. It is the story of enslaved people who fought back, who refused to accept bondage quietly, who risked everything for even a fleeting moment of freedom and agency. These stories make us uncomfortable because they challenge the sanitized versions we prefer, stories where slavery ended thanks to the kindness of white abolitionists or enlightened politicians, rather than through the persistent resistance of enslaved people themselves. The truth is that American slavery ended because enslaved people resisted it at every chance. Through 400,000 escaping via the Underground Railroad, through revolts and uprisings, through small acts of defiance, and yes, sometimes through violence against their oppressors. Patience was part of that larger story of resistance. Her son Samuel, sold to Louisiana at age 12, likely died in the sugar fields before reaching 18. Mortality rates on Louisiana sugar plantations were among the highest in the South. We have no record of his exact fate, but we can assume he endured brutal labor, poor food, disease, and violence. Whether he ever knew what his mother had done, whether he felt pride or horror, we cannot know. Somewhere in the fields of Louisiana, a boy loved fiercely by his mother worked and suffered and probably died young, another casualty of American slavery. If reading this story has made you angry, that is natural. If it has made you sad, that is natural. If it has made you uncomfortable, that is natural. These events really happened. They are part of American history, part of the foundation upon which modern America was built. Cotton picked by enslaved people clothed the nation and fueled the economy. Wealth built on enslaved labor created cities, universities, and industries. The legacies of slavery persist today, both visibly and quietly. Patience's story asks hard questions. What would you do if every human right was denied? What would you do if your child was stolen and sold? What would you do if the law saw you as property rather than a person? What would you do if your oppressors only understood violence? We cannot answer these questions from lives of comfort and safety. We can only recognize that Patience answered them in her own way, and that her answer, however violent or shocking, came from extreme injustice. As we remember Patience, we also honor the countless other enslaved people whose acts of resistance were never recorded, whose names are lost, who risked and suffered for their courage. They are the ancestors of millions of African Americans today, and their fight for freedom laid the foundation for every civil rights victory. The struggle for justice, equality, and dignity did not end with the abolition of slavery. It continues today in battles against systemic racism, police brutality, economic inequality, educational gaps, and many other ways. When we tell stories like Patience's, we do not glorify violence or seek revenge. We remember truth. We honor resistance. We refuse to let history be erased or sanitized. Remember Patience, daughter of Queen Effa, mother of Samuel, beekeeper, conjure woman, survivor of 31 years of slavery, orchestrator of one of the most unusual acts of rebellion in American history. Remember that she was fully human, even as a system tried to deny her humanity. Remember that she loved her son enough to risk everything. Remember that she used knowledge passed down through generations to fight oppression. Remember that she died unbroken, her spirit free even as her body was executed. And remember that for every Patience whose story survived, there are thousands more whose stories were lost, but whose resistance was equally real, courageous, and essential to the long struggle for freedom that defines the African, American, and American experience. The bees are long gone. The plantation has crumbled into ruins. The people who witnessed her death have turned to dust. Yet the story remains, passed down through generations, a reminder that resistance is always possible, that the oppressed will fight back, and that justice, even if delayed or imperfect, will eventually arrive. This is the story of Patience, who turned bees into weapons and destroyed a Mississippi plantation in 1856. It is a story of American slavery, American resistance, and American justice. It is uncomfortable, brutal, and necessary. It must be remembered so we never forget the cost of freedom and the price of oppression, and so that we can continue the unfinished work of building a society where no human is denied dignity, no mother loses her child, and no person lives in chains.